He was 9 years old when his mother's brother knelt beside a frozen hillside in Telemark and pressed the boy's hand flat against the moss. The moss was wet. It was soft. And beneath the ice, where everything should have been dead and locked shut, it was warm. The old man's breath caught in his beard as he said, "The earth still breathes here. Watch the ground in winter, and it will show you." 25 years later, in a settlement where every well had frozen and 27 people were rationing their last 16 gallons of water, a dog was pulling toward a ridge. And the boy who had felt that warmth remembered what it meant. Coldwater Camp sat 8 miles up a rocky draw from Minnetonka in the southern Black Hills of Dakota Territory. 27 people lived there in January of 1888. They had dugouts, frame shacks, 2 plank buildings, a schoolhouse with a cast iron stove, and a communal well that had never once failed them, until it did. The warm spell came first, 3 days of soft wind and dripping eaves in the second week of January, temperatures climbing high enough that men walked without gloves and children packed snowballs with bare hands. Tolef Brecka noticed the change and said nothing about it, because he had learned by then that saying things in Coldwater Camp only invited arguments. He was 34 years old, Norwegian-born, built like a man who had spent a decade hauling freight over bad roads. He owned 1 mule, 1 worn wagon, a Marlin rifle, 2 axes, a short-handled ice chisel, and a hunting dog named Rusk, who had better instincts than most people Tolef had met. He also owed $43 to the store, and the store was owned by a man who never forgot a debt. The warm spell broke on a Thursday evening. The wind turned so fast that the schoolteacher, a woman named Elsa Flayton, later said the air changed direction between one breath and the next. By midnight, the temperature had dropped past 0. By dawn, it was still falling. Snow came sideways, then upward, then in circles that made no sense against the ridgeline. The telegraph line to Rapid City went dead. The freight road vanished under drifts taller than a man on horseback, and the communal well froze at the pump rod. Tolef heard about it from Marte Lunde, his late wife's younger sister. Marte was 17, recovering from lung fever at the Haugen family's dugout. She came to his door wrapped in a horse blanket, coughing, and said the Haugens had sent their boy to the well at first light. The boy came back crying. The pump handle would not move. The rod was locked solid in the casing. Tolef pulled on his coat and walked to the well with his ice chisel. 4 men were already there, taking turns striking the pump housing with a sledge. The iron rang like a cracked bell in the cold. Frost crystals hung in the air around their heads. After 20 minutes, Tolef put his hand on the casing and felt the cold radiating through the metal like something alive. The water table had frozen from the surface down. The pump rod was not stuck. The water itself had turned to stone. He said, "We need to find the second well." The second well was a dug well, 60 yards behind the schoolhouse. 3 men had already tried it. The cribbing, the wooden frame that held the shaft walls, had buckled inward overnight. When Niels Haugen leaned over the edge, he could see ice and collapsed earth where there should have been open water. He came back shaking his head and said the well was gone. That left the creek. Tolef walked to the creek with Rusk at his heel. The dog moved carefully on the packed snow, nose working. The creek was a tributary draw, narrow and rocky, fed by runoff from the ridge. In summer, it ran clear and cold. In winter, it slowed to a trickle under a shelf of ice. Now, after the temperature collapse, the ice was not a shelf. It was a sealed channel, layered thick, with snow packed on top so dense that Tolef could stand on it without hearing a creak. He chopped a test hole with the chisel. Cloudy water, gravel-laced, barely a finger's depth before he hit frozen mud. The creek was dead. Tullough stood there in the wind and counted. 27 people, 8 horses, 6 milk cows. The settlement's stored water sat in barrels, kettles, and wash tubs scattered among the buildings. He walked from dwelling to dwelling and looked into every container. The total came to 16 gallons. 16 gallons for 27 people and 14 head of livestock, in temperatures that would freeze and expose bucket solid in under an hour. He knew the math before he finished counting. 1 kettle of snow, packed tight and melted over a stove, yielded barely enough water to fill a coffee pot. The fuel cost was enormous, a full stove load for a few cups. The town had maybe 12 cords of wood split and stacked between all the buildings combined, and every stick of it was needed for heat. Trading wood for water meant trading warmth for thirst, and the cold was not going to relent. Less than 36 hours. That was his estimate. After that, the weakest, the children, the elderly, Marte with her damaged lungs, would begin to fail. Not from cold, from the thing nobody thinks about when they imagine winter killing, the body drying out from the inside. Dr. Abner Callow arrived at the schoolhouse at mid-morning, walking stiffly through the drifts with his medical bag clutched against his chest. He was 61 years old, a Civil War surgeon who had seen men die in field hospitals from dysentery, gangrene, and wounds that should have been survivable. He had come west for reasons he never explained, settled near Cold Water Camp, and appointed himself the settlement's physician. Nobody had asked him to. Nobody had objected either. Callow took one look at the schoolhouse barrel, empty, the tin dipper resting on the dry bottom, and began giving orders. "Ration what remains," he said. 1 cup per person, morning and evening. No livestock water until the people are secure. Melt snow if you must, but do not waste fuel, and nobody leaves shelter to wander. The cold will kill you faster than the thirst. Tullough stood by the stove and listened. He respected Callow. The man had set a broken leg for the Haugen boy in October and charged nothing. He knew medicine, he knew death, but he did not know water. 36 hours, Tullough said. Callow looked at him. What? At 1 cup morning and evening, we have maybe 36 hours of water for the people, nothing for the animals, and the snow is dirty. You melt it, the grit settles, but the ash does not. The children will not drink it after the first cup. They will drink it when they are thirsty enough. They will vomit it, Tullough said. I have seen it. Ash melt on an empty stomach comes back up. You lose more water than you gain. Callow's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to being corrected by a freighter who owed $43 to the store. Then what do you suggest, Brecky? We walk to Minnetonka? The road is gone. The drifts are shoulder high past the 2nd mile. I know. Then stop counting and start conserving. Discipline will keep this town alive, not calculations. Tullough said nothing more. He picked up his chisel and walked out. Rusk followed him, nose to the wind. But the conversation had done its work. The people in the schoolhouse had heard Callow's verdict: conserve, ration, wait. And they had heard Tullough's numbers: 36 hours, and then the weakest would begin to die. Both men were right, and neither had a solution. The doubt sat in Tullough's chest like a stone. He had hauled freight through worse cold than this. He had broken ice on stock tanks in 40 below wind. But he had never faced a situation where every source of water, well, creek, rain barrel, snow melt, had failed simultaneously. The cold had not just frozen the water. It had locked it away, sealed it under layers of ice and earth and stone, as though the land itself had decided to stop giving. He walked back toward his shack with the wind cutting through his coat and the dog pressed against his leg. Rusk whined, not the whine of cold or hunger, but the high nasal sound he made when he smelled something he could not reach. Tolliff stopped. Rusk was facing uphill toward the ridge. The thing Tolliff remembered was his mother's brother, a man named Oddmund Kvama, kneeling beside a winter seep in Telemark when Tolliff was 9 years old. Oddmund was a stone worker who built and repaired spring houses, the low stone chambers that Norwegian farms used to keep water clean and cool in summer, unfrozen in winter. He was large-handed and quiet, and had a way of touching stone that made it seem like conversation. That winter morning, he had taken Tolliff to a hillside where the creek had frozen over, but something else was happening beneath the surface. Oddmund knelt, pressed his palm flat against the moss above the ice line, and held it there. "Feel," he said. Tolliff put his hand where Oddmund's had been. The moss was wet, soft, and faintly warm. "Warm water leaves signs before it shows itself," Oddmund said. "The moss does not freeze. The rock sweats. Animals come when they should not. Watch the ground in winter, and it will tell you where the earth still breathes." Tolliff had filed it away the way a child files everything, without knowing what it meant. 25 years later, standing in a frozen draw in Dakota Territory with a dehydrating settlement behind him and a dog pulling toward the ridge, the memory came back with the force of a hand on his shoulder. Rusk was not interested in the creek. The dog had ignored the exposed ice, the test holes, the gravel water. He kept turning uphill toward the granite bluff where the draw narrowed and the rock face rose 30 feet above the creek bed. A winter waterfall, frozen solid since November, hung like a white curtain against the stone. Tolliff had walked past that frozen waterfall 100 times. Everyone had. It was scenery, decoration, ice on rock. But Rusk would not stop pulling. Tolliff climbed. The slope was steep and icy, the footing treacherous where drifted snow concealed rock ledges. Rusk scrambled ahead, then circled back, then scrambled ahead again. At the base of the frozen waterfall, the dog began to dig, not pawing at snow, digging at a white mineral crust where the ice met stone, scraping with both front feet, whining. Tolliff knelt. He brushed away the dog's diggings and looked at the crust. It was not ordinary ice. It was thicker, opaque, streaked with faint yellow mineral stain. Behind it, where the rock face should have been solid, there was a darkness, a gap. He leaned close and breathed in. The smell hit him before anything else. Mineral, sulfur, wet stone, warm. He pulled off his right glove and pressed his fingers against the rock beside the crust. The stone was not frozen. It was cool, but not frozen. And the mineral crust, where he scratched it with a thumbnail, was soft underneath, damp. Something behind the ice was warm. Something was breathing. His heart hammered. He wanted to swing the chisel and break through immediately. But Oddmund's voice was in his head, not the memory of a lesson, but the memory of a warning. He had watched Oddmund approach a dozen seeps and springs, and the old man never rushed. "You do not break into a hill," Oddmund had said once. "You ask it to open." Tolliff chipped a hand-width vent, just enough to let air through. He held the chisel still and waited. Warm vapor curled through the opening, not steam, not boiling, but warm, damp air that fogged in the sub-zero cold and smelled of deep earth and mineral water. Rusk shoved his nose into the vent and sneezed. Tolliff pulled a strip of cloth from his coat lining and held it over the opening. The cloth went limp and damp in seconds, warm air, continuous, from deep inside the rock. He sat back on his heels. Above him, the ice groaned. The frozen waterfall was not stable. It was a curtain of layered ice over fractured limestone, and somewhere behind it, water was moving. Warm water, artesian water, pushed upward through fractures by pressure and earth heat, the same geological force that fed the hot springs near Minikata 8 miles down the draw. The question was whether this was a real chamber, accessible, deep enough, with water a person could reach and carry, or a pocket, a tease, warm air seeping through a crack in the rock with nothing usable behind it. Tolef looked down at the settlement. Smoke from the schoolhouse stove, no other movement, 27 people rationing 16 gallons. He looked back at the vent. The warm vapor was still curling. The ice above him groaned again. Marit Stanslin found Tolef at the bluff an hour later. She was 29, the best practical laborer in the settlement, and she had a way of appearing at exactly the moment when something needed to be questioned. "Hogan's boys said you were up here with the dog," she said. She looked at the vent, the mineral stain, the ice chisel marks. "What is this?" Tolef explained. "The warm air, the mineral smell, the dog's behavior, Oddman's teaching about spring signs." Marit listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Warm water does not hide behind ice. If it were there, we would have seen it in October. In October, the waterfall was running. The flow covered it, and the warm discharge would have mixed with creek water and cooled before anyone noticed." "You are guessing." "I am reading signs." He pointed at the moss. Green, soft, alive in a season when every other growing thing within miles was dead or dormant. He pointed at the mineral stain, yellow-white, the residue of dissolved limestone carried by water that had traveled deep underground. He pointed at the dog, who was lying beside the vent with his chin on his paws, eyes closed, breathing the warm air as though he had found a hearth. Merritt stared at the vent for a long time. "And if you widen this and there is nothing behind it, you have spent half a day, burned calories we cannot replace, and we are no closer to water." "Then we are no closer to water," Tolef said. "But if I do nothing, we are no closer either, and in 36 hours, less, now, the children start failing." Callow says to ration and wait. "Callow is counting bodies that have not died yet. I want to stop the count." Marit pulled her collar tighter. The wind was climbing. She looked at the vent, at the dog, at the mineral stain. She did not agree. She did not walk away. "Then show us a cup," she said. "One full cup of drinkable water from behind that rock, and I will carry the next one myself." She climbed back down toward the settlement. Tolef watched her go, then turned back to the vent. The warm air was still coming. Rusk had not moved. 1 cup. That was the test. 1 cup of clean, warm, drinkable water pulled from behind a frozen cliff face in the middle of the worst cold wave the Black Hills had seen in a decade. He picked up the chisel and began to widen the opening. The news traveled through Coldwater Camp, the way news always did in small settlements. Fast, distorted, and flavored by whoever carried it. By the time it reached Cassian Pike's store, the story was that Brecka had lost his mind. He was up on the bluff, chipping at ice, following his dog into the cliffs, while sensible men chopped creek ice and melted snow. Pike heard it and smiled. Not a kind smile. The smile of a man who keeps ledgers. Cassian Pike was 46 years old, the storekeeper, the claim lender, and the supplier of coal oil, flour, and feed for every family in Coldwater Camp. He extended credit the way a spider extends web, hot, generously, patiently, and with the understanding that everything caught belonged to him. Tolef owed him $43 from a failed hay contract. The Haugans owed him $31 for winter flour. The Vangen brothers owed him $68 between them. Pike did not worry about the debts. Debts were inventory. They matured into livestock, claims, and labor. What Pike wanted during the water crisis was control, a rationing system run through his store, using his containers, his fuel, his authority. The settlement in his debt, not just financially but practically, dependent on his organization for survival. What Pike did not want was Tolef Brecka leading people away from town on a chase that might prove the freighter was worth listening to. At midday, 3 men stood around Pike's counter drinking the last of his barrel coffee. Brecka follows his dog because men stopped following him, one of them said. The others laughed. His wife died because he was hauling freight instead of staying home, another added. This was crueler, and the laughter stopped. Pike let the silence hang. Then he said, "A dog cannot smell water through stone, Brecka." Tolef was not there to hear it. He was on the bluff with blood on his knuckles and ice chips in his beard, widening the vent one careful stroke at a time. But the words would reach him. Words always did. What Pike said next was worse, and said to Niels Haugen directly, "If Brecka wastes another day on that ridge, I will call his mule against the debt. The animal is worth more than his judgment." The threat was real. Pike held the note. The mule was Tolef's only working animal, the difference between earning a living and begging. If Pike seized it, Tolef had nothing left to haul with, nothing to trade, nothing to rebuild on. Haugen said nothing. He finished his coffee and left. He found Tolef at the bluff an hour later and told him what Pike had said. Tolef's hands stopped moving on the chisel. For a long moment he stared at the widening hole in the ice, at the warm vapor still curling out, at the dog who had not left the spot since morning. "How much time before he calls the note?" Tolef asked. He did not say, but he said it in front of witnesses. Tolef nodded. He could feel the doubt again, the stone in his chest that Dr. Callow had placed and Pike had just made heavier. His reputation in the settlement was already thin. The failed hay contract, the debts, the whisper about his wife. If he spent another day on this ridge and found nothing behind the ice, Pike would take the mule, Callow would say he warned them, and Marit Stensland would shake her head and carry snow to the kettles. But Rusk was still lying beside the vent. The warm air was still coming. And somewhere behind that ice, water was moving through fractured limestone with the heat of the deep earth still in it. Tolef picked up the chisel. "Tell Pike I will bring back 1 full kettle before dark," he said. "And tell Callow I'm not wandering." Haugen looked at him, then at the vent, then at the dog. "I will tell them," he said. And he climbed back down. The opening grew slowly. Tolef worked with the care of a man who understood that ice above his head could kill him as easily as any blizzard. He chipped, listened, chipped again. The chisel rang on solid ice, then thudded on something softer, layered ice with air pockets, the kind that forms over moving water. Behind the waterfall curtain, the rock face was fractured. Cracks ran vertically, some wide enough to fit fingers into, all of them damp. By mid-afternoon, the vent was 18 inches wide and roughly 2 feet tall. Tolef could see into the darkness beyond. The warm air came stronger now, steady and mineral sweet. He lit a match and held it at the opening. The flame bent inward, pulled by the air current. Whatever was behind the ice wall had volume, a space, a chamber. He chipped 2 more careful rows, and the ice gave way in a slab the size of a tabletop. He threw himself sideways as it crashed past him, spinning down the slope, and Rusk yelped and scrambled clear. When the ice dust settled, Tolef looked up and saw the opening, 3 feet wide, dark, breathing warm air like a living mouth in the face of the frozen bluff. He tied a rope from his belt to a cottonwood root 20 feet below, checked the knot twice, and crawled in. The passage was narrow for 6 feet, then opened. The ceiling rose. The walls went from ice to bare limestone, wet and gleaming in the matchlight. The mineral smell was strong. The air was warm enough that frost melted from his beard and dripped from his chin. He could hear water, not rushing, not falling. A low, continuous sound, like someone pouring from a great height into a deep basin, the sound of a spring feeding a pool in the dark. He struck another match. The chamber was perhaps 12 feet across and 8 feet high, rough walled, with a floor of flat stone sloping toward a natural basin where black water moved in slow circles. The water was not boiling. It was not steaming violently. But in the matchlight, he could see faint vapor rising from the surface, and when he knelt and dipped his hand in, the warmth shocked him. Not hot, warm, body warm, the temperature of a living thing. He cupped his hands and drank. The water was clean, mineral tasting, faintly sulfurous, but clean. It was the first liquid he had tasted in 20 hours that did not have the grit of snowmelt or the flat staleness of a barrel bottom. Rusk pushed past him, lapped at the basin, and sneezed again. Then the dog sat down, looked at Tolef, and wagged his tail once. The only time all day that anything in cold water camp had looked satisfied. Tolef filled his hat with water, held it against his chest to keep it from spilling, and crawled back out into the cold. The temperature hit him like a wall. The water in his hat began to cool immediately. He had maybe 10 minutes before it would start to freeze. He capped the hat with his free hand, tucked it inside his coat, and half slid, half climbed down the slope to the draw. He reached the schoolhouse at 4 in the afternoon. The light was already dying. Wind drove snow through every gap in the plank walls. 6 people sat around the stove, wrapped in everything they owned, not speaking. Tolef set the hat on the table. Water sloshed over the brim. Warm water, in January, in a settlement where every well was frozen and every creek was dead. Dr. Callow stood up from the bench. He looked at the hat, at the water, at Tolef's ice-crusted face and bleeding knuckles. He dipped a finger in, tested the temperature, and tasted it. "Where?" Callow said. "The bluff, behind the frozen waterfall. There is a spring chamber, fed by the same deep water that feeds the hot springs at Minikata." "How much?" "Enough. The flow is continuous. The basin refills as fast as I could cup it." Callow stared at him. The schoolteacher, Elsa Flaten, stood up. A child pressed close to the stove turned to look. Marte Lunda, wrapped in a horse blanket by the wall, opened her eyes. Nobody spoke. The water in the hat steamed faintly in the cold air of the schoolhouse, but Tolef saw what was in Callow's eyes, and it was not relief. It was calculation. The bluff was a 40-minute climb in good weather. In this wind, with this snow, with sick children and frostbitten adults, the climb would be dangerous. The entrance was a crawl space in an ice wall above a steep slope. The chamber could hold a dozen people, maybe, but not 27. Moving water down the slope in containers meant carrying it through sub-zero wind, losing heat with every step. The spring existed. The water was real, and the gap between discovering it and saving a town with it was enormous. Callow sat back down. "Steam is not water until every person in the settlement can drink it," he said, "and I will not send people up that ridge to die on the ice." The cup was full. The test was passed, and the argument was only beginning. Outside, the wind was rising, the temperature was still falling, and somewhere in the back of Pike's store, a man was sharpening a pencil to write the note that would take Tolef's mule. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? The first vent was open. The water was real. The town had seen proof in a hatful of warm spring water carried down from a frozen cliff. But proof and salvation were not the same thing. Tolef had found water. Now he had to make it reachable, make it carryable, make it survivable to access in the worst cold the Black Hills had delivered in a generation. He had one mule, two axes, an ice chisel, a dog, and maybe 20 hours before the weakest people in cold water camp began to die of dehydration in the middle of a blizzard. He did not sleep that night. He sat at his table with a stub of pencil and a piece of brown wrapping paper and drew the route from the settlement to the bluff. 60 yards of exposed slope, a rock ledge with no handholds. The ice wall now breached, but too narrow for anyone carrying a full vessel. The passage beyond tight and dark. The chamber itself warm and water-rich, but accessible only by crawling. He wrote numbers, distances, angles, time estimates for hauling water in lidded vessels, heat loss per minute in exposed containers, the weight of a full milk can versus the grip strength of a man with frozen gloves. The math was possible, barely. If he could widen the entrance, if he could cut footholds into the ice slope, if he could rig a rope line, if someone helped him. Rusk slept on the floor beside the stove, paws twitching. The dog had found the spring. The man had to build the road to it. Tolef folded the paper, put it in his coat pocket, and reached for his chisel. Dawn was still 2 hours away, but the temperature was not waiting for daylight, and neither could he. Tolef reached the bluff before dawn. The wind had not slowed. It came off the ridge in gusts that knocked him sideways on the slope, and he climbed with one hand on the rope he had tied the day before and the other gripping the chisel. Russ climbed ahead of him, sure-footed in the dark, pausing at every ledge to wait. The entrance was still open, but the edges had refrozen overnight. A crust of new ice narrowed the gap by 3 inches on each side. Tolef chipped it clear, his arms already tired from the climb, and crawled inside. The chamber was as he had left it, warm, dripping, the basin full and moving. He knelt and drank again, letting the mineral water fill his stomach, feeling the warmth spread through his chest and into his arms. Then he backed out and began the work that would determine whether the spring could save anyone beyond himself. The first problem was the entrance. A man could crawl through it, but not a man carrying a full milk can. Tolef needed 3 feet of width and 5 feet of height, enough to walk stooped with a vessel. The ice was layered, outer frost, compacted snow, old waterfall ice from autumn, and beneath it all the fractured limestone of the bluff itself. The stone he could not move. The ice he could, one chisel stroke at a time. He worked for 2 hours. The ice came away in slabs and chips that he kicked down the slope. His left glove soaked through and began to stiffen. He switched hands and kept going. By the time gray light crept over the ridge, the entrance was wide enough for a man carrying a bucket to pass through sideways. The second problem was the slope. 60 yards of exposed rock and ice between the chamber and the draw below, angled steep enough that a slip meant a fall of 20 feet onto frozen creek bed. Tolef had climbed it twice now, both times with the agility of a man who had spent years on freight wagons and timber slopes. Most of the people in Coldwater Camp were not freight haulers. They were farmers, storekeepers' wives, children, and one 61-year-old doctor with stiff knees. He needed a rope line, a fixed guide that a person could hold with one hand while carrying water with the other. He had one coil of hemp rope, 40 feet. The slope required at least 60. He tied the hemp to the cottonwood root at the bottom and ran it uphill, but it ended 20 feet short of the entrance. He stood in the wind, looking at the gap, and heard Rusk bark, not at him, downhill, at a figure climbing the slope. Marit Stensland carried a coil of braided rawhide over her shoulder, a kettle in one hand, and an expression that dared the wind to stop her. She reached Tolef, looked at his rope, looked at the gap, and tied the rawhide to the end of the hemp without a word. The combined line reached the entrance with 4 feet to spare. You said, "Show you a cup," Tolev said. "I saw the cup. Now I want to see if you can move a kettle." She looked at the entrance. "That is your spring?" "Go in." Marit crawled through. She was inside for 3 minutes. When she came out, her face was different. Not convinced. Marit Stensland would not be convinced by anything less than a full season of evidence, but changed. The doubt was still there, but something else had joined it. Something that looked like the beginning of a plan. "The water's clean?" she asked. "I drank it. Rusk drank it. Mineral taste, but clean." "The chamber's warm?" "Warm enough that your beard would drip if you had one." Marit did not smile. "How many can fit inside?" 12, maybe 15 if they sit close." "We have 27. "I know." "Then the water comes down. We do not move people up. Not yet. We carry." She filled the kettle from the basin, capped it with a square of canvas tied with cord, wrapped it in her coat, and started down the slope holding the rope line with her free hand. Tolev watched her descend. She did not slip. She did not spill. Marit Stensland had not agreed with him. She had done something better. She had started working. The boy arrived from Minikata at noon. He was 14, half frozen, sent by Marte Lunde's host family to check on the settlement. Marit intercepted him at the schoolhouse, gave him warm water from the kettle, and wrote a note on the back of a feed receipt. Brekka found warm breath in the cliff. Send Oddmund Kvame if he can walk. The boy left with the note stuffed inside his shirt. Tolev did not know about the message until the next morning, when a figure appeared at the bottom of the draw leading a mule that was not his own. Oddmund Kvame was 68 years old. He walked with a lean to the left from a hip injury sustained 30 years earlier while setting stone in a Norwegian churchyard. His hands were enormous, scarred across every knuckle, and his beard was white and cut short in the way of men who work near fire. He carried a mason's hammer, a worn auger, and a canvas sack that clinked with iron tools Tolev did not recognize. Oddmund stopped at the base of the slope, looked up at the ice-crusted bluff, and said, "Show me." Tolev led him up. The old man climbed slowly, one hand on the rope line, breathing hard but steady. At the entrance, he paused, ran his fingers along the ice edge, and pressed his palm flat against the exposed limestone above the opening. He held it there for 10 seconds. "Madison Formation," he said, "the same stone that feeds the warm pools below. This fracture runs deep." He looked at Tolev. "How did you find it?" "The dog." Oddmund looked at Rusk, who was lying in his usual spot beside the entrance, chin on paws. "The dog found it," Oddmund said. "You recognized it. That is different." They crawled inside together. Oddmund stood in the chamber. He was short enough to stand nearly upright, and surveyed the walls, the ceiling, the basin. He struck the rock with his chisel handle in 7 places, listening to each impact the way a doctor listens to a chest. Tap, tap, tap. Hollow sounds and solid sounds, and the wet thud of ice-backed stone. "The roof is rock," he said, "not ice. The ice is only at the entrance, where the waterfall sealed it. Inside, you are under the hill. This will not collapse." Tolev felt something release in his chest that he had not known he was holding. "But the entrance will refreeze every night," Oddmund continued, "and the floor is mud past the basin. Foot traffic will foul the water within 2 days, and your rope line is 40 feet short of safe." Marit brought rawhide. The line reaches. "Rawhide stretches when wet. It will sag under a man's weight by tomorrow. You need lodgepole stakes driven into the rock cracks as anchor points, and the rope must be doubled. Odman set his canvas sack on the floor and opened it. Inside were iron spikes, a hand drill, a roll of waxed twine, and a folding rule. I did not come to watch. Where do we begin? What followed was 2 days of labor that would have broken most men. Ottoman taught the way he had always taught, through action, not explanation. He did not describe what a springbox should look like. He built one using planks that Tollef sledged up from the settlement on a makeshift sled, barrel hoops that Merritt pried from a broken washtub, and flat stones carried from the creek bed. The springbox sat at the edge of the basin, a three-sided enclosure with a plank floor raised 2 inches above the mud, a clean dipping point where water could be scooped without stirring silt, and a drainage channel that sent overflow away from the entry path. Vent before breach, Odman said, stopping Tollef from widening a second crack in the chamber wall. Let the hill breathe first. Pressure builds behind ice. You open too fast. The vapor loosens what holds the ceiling. Open slow. Let the warm air find its own path. Tollef watched and learned. Odman showed him how to sound the roof, tapping with the hammer handle, ear pressed close, distinguishing dead ice from rock-backed ice by the pitch of the ring. Dead ice sang, rock thudded. The difference meant the difference between a stable ceiling and one that could drop a 100-pound slab on a man's head. They drove sharpened lodgepole stakes into frozen cracks along the slope to serve as handholds and anchor points. They replaced the rawhide section of the rope line with doubled hemp, tied at 4-foot intervals to the stakes. They laid a crude plank walkway across the worst section of the approach, 8 feet of bare rock angled at 30 degrees, and nailed cross slats for traction. Tollef cut willow switches from the creek bank, stripped them, and tied them with rawhide into mats that could be laid on ice for footing. Odman watched him do this and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Your uncle taught you more than you remember." "He was not my uncle. He was my mother's brother." "In Norway, that is the same thing." "In Norway, many things were the same that are different here." Odman looked at him with an expression Tollef could not read. Then the old man hung a wet cloth strip at the entrance and a second one deeper inside the chamber on the far wall near the basin. "Watch these," he said. "The outer one will stiffen, the inner one will stay limp. As long as the inner cloth is soft, the air inside is warm enough to sustain people. If it stiffens, the cold is winning, and the chamber has failed." The outer cloth froze stiff within an hour. The inner cloth remained damp and limp through the night and into the next morning. The warm air held. Progress came in pieces, and each piece cost something. First vent opened, warm vapor confirmed. This was the day before, already spent. Entry widened to 3 feet by 5. One man could walk stooped. Cost, Tollef's left glove frozen solid after he plunged his hand into slush-clearing debris. He worked the rest of the day with a rag wrapped around his fingers. Springbox set. Water ran clear after silt settled for 20 minutes. Cost, Odmund overreached while placing the last stone, and his hip locked. Marit had to help him stand. Rope line fixed and doubled. Descent still dangerous but manageable for an able-bodied adult. Cost, an entire afternoon of labor that could have been spent carrying water. First 10 gallons delivered to the settlement, carried in 2 milk cans and 3 coffee boilers by Tollef, Marit, and 2 teenage boys. The settlement had water, but the delivery had taken 4 hours, and the containers lost heat so fast that by the time the last boiler reached the schoolhouse, the water inside was barely above freezing. Tollef did the math on the brown wrapping paper. 4 hours for 10 gallons. The settlement needed at least 20 gallons a day to keep people functional, 40 if they wanted to water the surviving livestock. At this rate, he would need 8 hours of carrying per day in sub-zero wind up and down a slope that could kill a person with one misstep. We need more carriers, he told Marit, and we need containers that hold heat. Pike has empty kerosene tins, dozens of them, stacked behind the store. They have lids. Pike will not release them. Pike will release them, Marit said, or I will take them. This was not an idle threat. Marit Stensland had the build of a woman who split her own firewood and the temperament of a woman who did not ask permission. But Pike's store was Pike's property, and in cold water camp, property was the closest thing to law. Tollef went to the store himself. Pike was behind the counter, hands flat on the wood, watching the door as though he had been expecting the visit. I need the kerosene tins, Tollef said. They are mine. The town needs them. People are drinking water out of hats and cook pots. The tins have lids. They hold heat. Then buy them. I owe you $43 already. Pike smiled. 47, interest accrued at the new year. Tollef stood in the cold store and felt the anger rise through his chest like a second kind of heat. $4 of interest on $43 of debt, calculated while people rationed water by the cup. But he kept his voice level. What do you want for the tins? Sign over the mule. The debt clears. The tins are yours. The mule is how I earn. Without the mule, I cannot haul. Without hauling, I cannot pay anything. That, Pike said, is not my problem. Tollef left without the tins. He walked back to the bluff in the dark with his jaw clenched and his hands shaking, not from cold, but from the effort of not turning around. Oddmund was waiting at the entrance with a lantern. He looked at Tollef's empty hands and said, He wants the mule. He wants control. He has always wanted control. The water threatens it. Oddmund paused. How many tins? Marit counted 32, all with lids. Then we will carry water in what we have until the town decides it wants those tins more than it fears that man. It was not a solution. It was a delay. And the cold was not delaying anything. Dr. Callow came to the bluff on the second afternoon. He climbed the rope line slowly, stopping twice to catch his breath, and stood at the entrance with frost in his eyebrows and skepticism in every line of his face. Show me, he said. Tollef led him inside. Callow stood in the chamber and looked at the spring box, the basin, the dripping walls, the cloth strips, stiff at the entrance, limp at the far wall. He knelt and tested the water the way he tested everything, methodically, without enthusiasm. He tasted it. He felt the air temperature. He examined the floor for standing water and the ceiling for loose rock. The water is acceptable, he said. The air is warm. The chamber is stable. But, Tollef said, but moving the sick to this place will kill them on the slope. Marte Lunda can barely stand. The Hugin infant has not nursed properly in 2 days. Old Ivor Tveit cannot climb 10 feet, let alone 60 yards. Then we bring the water to them. You have been bringing the water to them? 10 gallons in 4 hours. It is not enough, and you are exhausting yourself. Callow looked at him with the directness of a man who had watched hundreds of people die and learned to say the unsayable. Brecca, you have found water. That is more than anyone else has done. But access is not delivery. If the next cold front hits before you can move enough water, the spring might as well be in China. Then help me move people up. I will not authorize that. I am not asking for authorization. I am asking for help. Callow stared at him. The cloth strip at the entrance fluttered in the draft. Somewhere above, wind screamed over the ridgetop. If one person falls on that slope, Callow said. I am the one who sets the bones. If one person dies of exposure during the climb, I am the one who closes the eyes. You are asking me to risk lives on a path I would not walk myself if I had a choice. You do not have a choice, Tolef said. None of us do. That is the point. Callow left without agreeing. But he did not forbid it, and in Cold Water Camp, silence from the doctor was as close to permission as anyone was going to get. By the evening of the second day, the spring access was as good as 3 people and an old stoneworker could make it. 2 milk cans could be filled in 7 minutes. Water carried in lidded vessels and wrapped in blankets stayed drinkable for the descent. The chamber could hold 12 people seated on stone ledges, with room for more if they stood. The spring flow was continuous. The basin refilled as fast as it was emptied. Oddman sat by the entrance at dusk and pulled out a battered pocket thermometer. He held it inside the chamber for 5 minutes, shielded from the draft. 85 degrees. The same range as the warm springs at Minikata, fed by the same deep limestone aquifer, heated by the same slow geological furnace miles beneath the surface. It will not drop, Oddman said. The earth does not change its mind in January. The settlement's barrel count stood at 14 gallons, barely better than the 16 they had started with, despite 2 days of hauling. The problem was not supply. The problem was the bottleneck, the slope, the cold, the time it took to carry water down and keep it from freezing. Mar had organized a rotation. 3 women brought laundry boilers, bed ticking, and every clean jar in the settlement. They wrapped the vessels in quilts and carried them in pairs, one holding the rope line and one carrying the load. It was slow. It was exhausting. But by nightfall, 20 gallons sat in the schoolhouse, and another 10 had been distributed to the dugouts. Men argue about springs, Marit said, wrapping a boiler in a quilt for the next run. Women carry water. Tolef did not argue. He was too tired to argue. His hands were cracked and bleeding from the chisel work. His left shoulder ached from a fall on the slope that morning. He had eaten 1 meal in 2 days, a fistful of dried beef and a cup of the warm spring water that tasted like the inside of the earth. But the water was moving. The town was drinking. And for the first time since the cold wave hit, nobody had rationed a child to half a cup. The calm lasted 6 hours. The second cold front announced itself at midnight. Not with wind, the wind had never stopped, but with a silence underneath the wind. The kind of silence that meant the air itself had changed composition, grown denser, heavier, colder than anything the first wave had delivered. Tolef woke in his shack and knew before he opened his eyes. The stove had not gone out, but the heat could not reach the walls. Frost had formed on the inside of the window, then on the inside of the door, then on the nail heads holding the planks together. The temperature was falling so fast that the wood itself seemed to be contracting, the shack groaning like a ship in heavy seas. He pulled on every piece of clothing he owned and opened the door. The world was gone. Snow moved horizontally in sheets so thick that the schoolhouse, 30 yards away, was invisible. The lantern hanging outside Pike's store was a dim yellow smear. The sound was not wind anymore. It was pressure, the atmosphere leaning on the earth with the weight of a continent of Arctic air. Rapid City, 60 miles east, would record temperatures that plunged far below zero in the hours that followed. Cold Water Camp, higher and more exposed, was colder still. Tolef found Marit at the schoolhouse. She was already dressed, already calculating. Inside, 20 people huddled around the stove. The barrel held maybe 8 gallons. The kerosene lamp threw shadows that moved with the draft. Marte collapsed an hour ago, Marit said. Fever and dehydration. Callow says she will not survive until morning unless she gets warm liquid and humid air. Tolliff looked at Marte. She was lying on a bench near the stove, wrapped in blankets, her lips cracked and her breathing shallow. 17 years old, his dead wife's sister, the only family he had left in the territory. Humid air, Tolliff said. Callow's words. He says her lungs are failing because the air is too cold and too dry. She needs warmth and moisture. The chamber. The warm, damp, mineral-rich air of the spring chamber. 85 degrees and humid enough to soften frozen cloth. We move her up, Tolliff said. In this? Marit gestured at the door. The wind screamed beyond it. We move her up or she dies here. Callow heard them from across the room. He came over, his face gray with exhaustion. I said warm liquid and humid air. I did not say carry her up a frozen cliff in a whiteout. You said she will not survive until morning. It is already past midnight. What does your medicine offer between now and dawn? Callow did not answer. The chamber is warm, Tolliff said. The air is wet. The spring is flowing. If we get her inside, she has a chance. If she stays here, you already told me what happens. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because what happens in the next few minutes decides whether the spring saves the town or becomes another grave in the snow. The argument lasted 3 minutes. Callow agreed on one condition. He would come too, and if the climb became impossible, they would turn back. Tolliff organized the first group. Marte carried on a plank sled dragged by rope. 2 children, the Haugen infant bundled against its mother, and a 5-year-old boy with blue lips and a cough that sounded like gravel. Old Ivar Tveit, the elderly widower who had not spoken in 2 days and whose hands were the color of candle wax. Callow, carrying his medical bag. Marit, carrying blankets and a lantern. Tolliff went first with Rusk. The dog vanished into the snow within 4 steps. Tolliff could hear him but not see him. He held the rope line with his right hand and pulled Marte's sled with his left, leaning into the wind like a man trying to walk through a wall. The snow was not falling. It was attacking, driven horizontal, finding every gap in clothing, every inch of exposed skin, every opening in the wrapping around Marte's body. The rope line was his lifeline. Without it, the slope was invisible. The landmarks, the cottonwood root, the rock ledge, the lodgepole stakes were buried under drifting snow. He climbed by feel, counting hand over hand on the rope, feeling the stakes pass under his grip. Halfway up, the rope disappeared. Not cut. Buried. A drift had piled across the middle section of the slope, covering the rope and the stakes beneath 2 feet of new snow. Tolliff stopped. Behind him, Marit held the lantern up, but the light only made the snow glow orange and revealed nothing. "The line is gone," he shouted. The wind tore the words apart. Rusk barked, not behind him, ahead. The dog had kept climbing, following the path by scent and memory, and was barking from somewhere above and to the left. Tolliff let go of the buried rope and began to climb freehand, pulling the sled, using his chisel as an ice axe, driving it into the slope with each step. Oddmund was supposed to be at his cabin. He was not at his cabin. The old man appeared out of the snow like a figure from a saga, crawling forward on hands and knees along the upper section of the slope, having come from the chamber entrance where he had been sleeping beside the spring box. He had heard Rusk barking and crawled out into the storm. Oddmund found the buried rope by reaching under the drift with his bare hand. He pulled it free, shook off the snow, and held it up. Tolliff grabbed it. The line was whole. The drift had merely covered it. But Oddmund's right palm was laid open. The rope had frozen into the ice around a stake, and pulling it free had dragged the frozen hemp across his skin like a blade. Blood ran black in the lantern light, mixing with snow. The old man wrapped his hand in a strip of shirt tail, said nothing, and led them up the last 20 yards to the entrance. The ice lip had refrozen. 3 inches of new ice narrowed the opening. Tolliff drove his chisel into it while Marte lay on the sled behind him, motionless, her breath barely visible. The ice shattered. He kicked the fragments aside and pulled the sled through. Inside, the warmth hit them like a hand laid on a cold face. The air was damp, mineral sweet, and warm enough that the frost on Tolliff's beard began to melt and drip before he had taken 2 steps. The lantern light caught the spring basin, the water moving in slow circles, the cloth strip on the far wall still limp and damp. Callow entered last. He stood in the chamber breathing hard, his medical bag clutched to his chest, and looked around with an expression Tolliff had not seen on the old surgeon's face before. Something between disbelief and recognition. The look of a man who had spent his life in field hospitals watching people die and had just walked into a place where the earth itself was trying to keep them alive. "Here," Callow said. He pointed to a flat ledge near the basin. "Put her here." They unwrapped Marte and laid her on blankets on the stone. Callow cupped warm water from the basin and held it to her lips. She drank, coughed, drank again. The humid air surrounded her cracked lungs like a compress. Within 10 minutes, her breathing changed, still labored, but deeper, steadier, the shallow gasps giving way to something that sounded like sleep. The 5-year-old boy stopped coughing. The Haugen mother nursed her infant in warmth for the first time in 3 days. Old Ivar Tveit sat on a stone ledge with his hands in the warm water and wept without sound. 12 people. The chamber held 12, but 27 lived in Coldwater Camp, and the ones who had not climbed were still in the schoolhouse, still rationing, still listening to the wind tear at the plank walls. The second group left the schoolhouse an hour later, led by Deputy Marshal Enoch Vale. Vale was not a brave man, but he was a stubborn one. He had watched the first group disappear into the storm and done nothing. Then he had watched the water level in the barrel drop by another 2 gallons and done something. He took 6 people, 3 adults and 3 children. They carried blankets, 2 kettles, and a lantern that blew out 40 feet from the schoolhouse door. They climbed blind. Tolliff did not know they were on the slope until Rusk bolted from the chamber entrance and disappeared into the storm. The dog was gone for 7 minutes. Tolliff stood at the opening, shouting into the wind, hearing nothing. Then Rusk appeared, running hard, circling back, running again, the herding behavior of a dog leading something home. Vale's group emerged from the snow one by one, frost-blind and shaking. A woman was carrying a child under each arm. A man had lost a boot and climbed the last 30 yards with a flour sack wrapped around his foot. Vale himself had a rope burn across his neck where the line had pulled tight in a stumble. They were alive. They were inside. The chamber now held 19 people, and the air was so thick with body heat and spring vapor that Tolliff could barely see the far wall. Outside, 8 people remained in the settlement. 3 of them were Pike, his clerk, and a customer who had been trapped at the store when the storm hit. Pike had refused to go, calling the climb a death march, but he had sent his clerk to watch the first group leave, and the clerk had not come back. The other 5, 2 ranch hands, a widow, and the Vangen brothers, yes, were in their own shelters, either unwilling or unable to reach the schoolhouse. The Vangen brothers, Halvor and Sjur, were in a hay shed half a mile from town, trying to melt snow over a makeshift fire. They had no news of the spring. They had no rope line. They had no dog. Halvor Vangen would be found 2 days later, alive but delirious, his words making no sense, his body running on the last reserves of a man who had gone 72 hours without drinkable water. Schure's hands were blackened with frostbite so severe that Dr. Callow later said he had never seen tissue survive in that condition. Both brothers lived, neither fully recovered. Their hay-shed vigil became the measure of what happened when the cold took the water and no one found it again. Inside the chamber, the hours passed in a rhythm that was not comfort, but was no longer crisis. Callow rationed the spring water in measured doses, small sips frequently, so that dehydrated stomachs would not reject it. He moved among the people on the stone ledges with his hands cupped, tipping warm water into mouths, checking pulses, pressing his ear against chests. Marte's fever broke near dawn. She opened her eyes, saw the dripping stone above her, felt the warm air on her face, and said, "Where is this?" "Inside the hill," Tolov said. "It is warm." "Yes." She looked at him with the clarity of a person who has been very close to something final and come back from it. "Your dog?" "Rusk found it." Marte closed her eyes and slept. Real sleep. The first any of them had seen from her in days. Oddman sat by the entrance through the night, despite his cut hand and the exhaustion that made his breathing audible across the chamber. He kept the ice from reforming at the lip, chipping at it every hour with his good hand, ensuring the passage stayed open. Toward morning, he coughed into his sleeve, and Tolov saw the cloth come away dark. Not red in the lantern light. Dark. "You need to rest," Tolov said. "The entrance needs to stay open." "I will take the entrance. Sleep." Odmund looked at him. The old man's face was the color of chalk in the lantern light, the lines deeper than they had been 2 days ago, the eyes bright with the kind of energy that sometimes visits a body shortly before it spends its last. But he nodded and moved to a ledge near the basin and closed his eyes. Tolov took the chisel and sat at the entrance. The wind was still screaming, the snow was still horizontal, but inside the chamber, 19 people breathed humid air, drank warm water, and waited for a dawn that would come whether the storm allowed them to see it or not. By morning, the storm had not stopped, but it had thinned enough to see 20 feet. Tolov sent Marit and Vale down the rope line to check the settlement. They came back with the news. The schoolhouse stove had gone out. The remaining barrels had frozen. Pike's store was locked, but the people who had stayed in the schoolhouse overnight, the 3 who had not joined either climbing group, were alive, cold, frightened, dehydrated, but alive. They had burned the last of the schoolhouse wood and huddled together under every blanket in the building. Tolov and Marit brought them up. The slope was easier in daylight, even with the drifts. The rope line held. The entrance, chipped clear by oddmen through the night, was wide enough for the last arrivals to walk through without crawling. 24 people in the chamber now. 3 remained, Pike, his clerk, and the stranded customer locked in the store with Pike's inventory and Pike's refusal. Nobody went for them, not because the town was cruel, because the town was exhausted and Pike had locked his own door. The dawn light entered the chamber through the widened entrance and caught the spring water in the basin, turning it from black to amber to pale gold as the angle shifted. 19 children and adults sat on stone ledges, wrapped in blankets, drinking warm water, breathing air that smelled of earth and mineral, and the deep, patient heat of limestone 2,000 feet below the surface. The spring had held. The flow had not faltered, not slowed, not cooled. The chamber had absorbed the body heat of 24 people without losing its own warmth. The cloth strip on the far wall was still limp, still damp, still soft. Callow sat beside the basin. He had not slept. He cupped water and poured it slowly over Marte's cracked lips while she slept. Then he looked at Tolef, standing at the entrance with the chisel in his bleeding hand and the dog at his feet, and said something he would not repeat in public for another 2 days. The spring is holding, your method is holding. He paused. I was counting bodies before I counted signs. Tolef nodded. He was too tired to feel the weight of the words. He would feel them later, much later, when the crisis was over, and the memory of Callow's voice in the amber light of the spring chamber became one of the things he carried for the rest of his life. But not now. Now he had 24 people alive, 3 refusing help, livestock dying of thirst in the settlement below, and a storm that was not finished. The spring had saved them. The spring had not finished saving them. And the hardest part, the part where survival turned into something larger, had not yet begun. The storm broke on a Saturday morning, not all at once. The wind eased in stages, like a fist slowly opening. But by noon, the sky showed cracks of blue between the clouds, and the drifts had stopped moving. The temperature remained brutal, well below zero, but the air was still, and stillness after 3 days of screaming wind felt almost warm. Tolef led the first group back down the slope at midday. The rope line held. The plank walkway was buried, but findable. The lodgepole stakes stood where they had been driven, crusted with ice, but solid. 24 people descended in groups of 4 and 5, moving slowly, holding the line, carrying blankets and empty vessels. The settlement looked like a place that had been held underwater and released. Snow covered everything to the eaves. The schoolhouse door was blocked by a drift taller than a man. Tolef and Vale dug it clear. Inside, the stove was cold, the barrels frozen, the benches shoved together where the last huddlers had pressed close for warmth. But the people were alive, all of them. Every person who had reached the chamber had survived. The ones who had not reached it were a different story. Pike emerged from his store that afternoon, stiff-legged, silent, his clerk trailing behind him with a face the color of old snow. They had survived on the water in Pike's private barrel, the one he kept behind the counter, refilled from his own well before the freeze, and on coal oil heat from his inventory. The stranded customer, a freight buyer named Dahl, had slept on feed sacks and eaten nothing for 2 days. All 3 were dehydrated and shaken, but alive. The Vangen brothers were found the next morning. Deputy Vale and 2 ranch hands followed Rusk to the hayshed half a mile south. Halvor was conscious but incoherent, speaking in a mixture of Norwegian and English that made no sense. Sjur was conscious and silent, his hands held against his chest, the fingers black past the second knuckle. They had tried to melt snow over a hay fire. The fire had given them smoke and warmth, but barely any water. 72 hours of thirst had done what the cold alone might not have. It had taken them to the edge of something they could not come back from entirely. Callow treated them in the schoolhouse with warm spring water carried down in the first delivery of the day. He soaked Sjur's hands in mineral water, wrapped them in wet cloth, and said nothing about the prognosis. The saying nothing was the prognosis. The public admission came 2 days later, and it happened the way most important things happened in cold water camp, without ceremony, in the middle of another task, overheard by enough people to become permanent. Callow was distributing water at the schoolhouse. Tolef had brought 40 gallons down from the spring by noon, using the rotation Marit had organized, 3 two-person teams carrying lidded milk cans and wrapped boilers, each team making 2 round trips before resting. The system was working, the water was flowing, the settlement was drinking. Callow filled a cup from the barrel, handed it to the Hogan boy, and turned to Tolif. I was counting bodies before I counted signs, he said. Not quietly, not whispered as a private concession. He said it in the schoolhouse with 6 people listening, in the flat voice of a man stating a medical conclusion. Your dog read the hill better than I did. Tolif said, You kept people alive long enough for the spring to matter. Without your rationing, we would have lost someone before I found the vent. Callow shook his head. Do not soften it. I told you not to go. I told you to conserve and wait. If you had listened to me, Marta Lund would be dead. He paused. You were right. I was wrong. The spring is real, and it saved this settlement. He picked up his medical bag and walked out. The 6 people in the schoolhouse watched him go. Nobody spoke. Then Elsa Flatten, the schoolteacher, poured herself a cup of warm water from the barrel, drank it, and said to Tolif, You should teach us how you knew, what to look for. It was the dog, Tolif said. It was not only the dog, Elsa said, and you know it. Marit Stensland's conversion was not a single moment. It was a process, and it looked like work. She had carried water from the first day Tolif showed her the chamber. She had organized the rotation, recruited the women, browbeaten the teenage boys into service, and kept a tally of every gallon delivered to every household. But she had never said he was right. She had said, Show me a cup. And then she had carried cups by the 100 without conceding the principle. Her concession came the way Marit did everything, through evidence, verified personally. A week after the storm, with the settlement drinking steadily and the livestock revived on spring water hauled in kerosene tins that Pike had finally released under community pressure, Marit climbed to the chamber alone, not to carry water, to examine the spring. She spent an hour inside. Tolif found her sitting beside the basin with the settling barrel open, testing the water for grit by letting it run through a piece of linen. She had brought a candle and was studying the walls, the mineral stain, the fracture lines, the moss that grew near the entrance where faint light reached. The flow has not changed, she said. It was not a question. It has not changed since the first day. The temperature? Ottoman measured 85 degrees. It holds. Marit folded the linen. I owe you an answer to something. You said warm water hides behind ice. I said if it were there, we would have seen it in October. She looked at him. I was wrong. In October, the waterfall masked it. The warm discharge mixed with the creek and cooled. The only reason the spring became visible was the freeze. The creek stopped flowing and the warm vent had nothing to mix with. The ice revealed it by trying to seal it. The cold showed us what the cold was hiding, Tolif said. Yes, she paused, and the dog smelled it before the cold finished its work. This was the closest Marit Stensland would ever come to an apology, and Tolif recognized it for what it was, not submission, not humility, a correction entered into her personal record with the same precision she brought to every tally and ledger. From that day, Marit did not carry water. She managed it. She assigned teams, tracked deliveries, maintained the schedule, and kept a chalk rotation on a board nailed to the schoolhouse wall. She treated the spring the way she treated every resource, as something that required management, not faith. The settlement changed in the weeks that followed, and the change was measurable. Before the spring, 16 gallons stored, rationed by cups, snow melt too slow and too fuel expensive to sustain the town. After the spring, 40 gallons delivered by noon each day, 80 by nightfall, once the kerosene tins entered the rotation. The chamber held stable warmth while outside water froze in a bucket in under an hour. Families assigned themselves to water teams. The Haugans took the morning shift. The ranch hands covered midday. Marit's women ran the afternoon and stacked the settlement's barrels full by dark. Children too young to climb carried water from the barrels to the dugouts, taking pride in the duty the way children take pride in anything that gives them purpose. Dr. Callow began sending patients to the chamber itself, not for water, for air. The warm, humid atmosphere inside the spring house eased frostbitten lungs, calmed croupy children, and gave the elderly a place to sit in warmth without burning firewood. He called it mineral air treatment and wrote the term in his notebook with the seriousness of a man who believed he was documenting something new. He was not, of course. The warm springs at Minnetonka had been used for healing long before any settler arrived. The Sioux and Cheyenne had known the warm mineral waters for generations, had bathed in them, camped near them, and regarded them as places of power and restoration. Callow's notebook was not discovery. It was a late entry in a record that predated him by centuries. But the spring was saving his patients, and Callow was not a man who argued with results. Pike's reaction to the spring's success was exactly what Tolliff had expected, and exactly what the town should have feared. On the first Monday after the storm, Pike opened his store and announced new terms. The kerosene tins, released under pressure during the crisis, were now available for continued use at a rental fee of 2 cents per day per tin. The blankets loaned to the climbing parties were assessed at replacement value. The coal oil burned during the storm was tallied against each household's account. He presented the figures to Niels Haugen first, because the Haugens owed the most after Tolliff. Haugen brought the bill to Marit. Marit looked at it, turned it over, and said, "This is not what he charged last autumn." She produced a ledger, not Pike's ledger, her own. Marit Stensland had kept a parallel record of every purchase, every credit extension, every price quoted at Pike's counter for the past 18 months. She had done it for the same reason she did everything, because she did not trust numbers she had not written herself. The comparison was damning. Pike's crisis charges were double his autumn prices. His interest calculations used a rate he had never quoted. His replacement values for the blankets assumed new goods, not the threadbare inventory he actually stocked. Mart nailed the comparison to the schoolhouse wall beside her water rotation board. Pike came to the schoolhouse that evening and tore it down. Mart nailed it up again the next morning with a note. "These numbers are witnessed. The original tallies are kept in 3 separate locations." Pike did not tear it down a second time, but his eyes, when he looked at Tolliff across the settlement's single street, carried something colder than the January wind. The spring had not just saved the town. It had shifted the balance of power in Coldwater Camp away from the man who had built his authority on scarcity and debt, and toward a freighter who owed $47 and followed his dog. The war was not over. It had changed shape. In the 3rd week of February, Oddmund and Tolliff worked side by side in the chamber for the last time. They were building a stone-lined basin, a permanent replacement for the plank and barrel spring box they had thrown together during the crisis. Oddmund had drawn the design on a scrap of canvas with charcoal, a half circle of flat stones set in clay, with a lip 3 inches above the waterline to prevent foot mud from entering the dip pool, and a drainage channel cut into the floor that would carry overflow away from the entry path toward a natural crack in the far wall. It was Norwegian spring housework, adapted for the materials at hand. The stones came from the creek bed, carried up the slope in canvas slings. The clay came from a deposit Oddman found at the back of the chamber, where the limestone met a band of softer shale. The tools were his own, the mason's hammer, the worn auger, a chisel he had carried across the Atlantic and sharpened on 3 continents. They worked in the warm, damp air, their coats off, sleeves rolled, the mineral smell of the spring surrounding them like a second atmosphere. Oddman placed each stone with the attention of a man who understood that water respects only what is built to receive it. He tapped stones into place, tested their seat with his fingers, adjusted by fractions of an inch. You build a spring box the same way you build a church floor, he said. Every stone bears weight. Every joint holds water. If one fails, you rebuild it before you continue. Tolliff watched and handed stones. He had learned more from Odman in 3 weeks than he had learned from any man in 10 years of freight work. Not just techniques, attitudes. The way Odman approached a spring was the way some men approached prayer, with attention, patience, and the understanding that the thing being addressed was older and more powerful than the person addressing it. "You are stronger than me," Odman said, setting the last basin stone into its bed of clay. "Your hands are better, your eyes are good, but you build too fast." "We needed to build fast. People were dying." "People were dying, and you saved them. But the spring will be here after the crisis, and what you build for it now must last beyond the emergency." Odman pressed the clay smooth with his thumb. "Finding water is luck. Keeping it clean is character." It was the kind of statement that sounded simple and was not. Tolliff would repeat it to himself many times in the years that followed, and each time it would mean something slightly different. They finished the basin at dusk. Odman sat on the stone ledge where Marte had lain during the crisis, his back against the warm wall, his breath coming in shallow draws. The cough that had started during the storm had not gone away. It had deepened, settled into his chest like a tenant that would not leave. "I want to show you one more thing," Odman said. He reached into his canvas tool sack and pulled out a notebook, small, leather-bound, the pages stiff with age and water damage. Norwegian springhouse records, written in Odman's hand, and in other hands before his, measurements, stone types, flow rates, seasonal variations, repair notes spanning 40 years in 2 countries. "This is for you," he said, "not because you need it now, because you will need it when I am not here to tell you what it says." Tolliff took the notebook. It weighed almost nothing. It weighed everything. "You are not dying," he said. Odman looked at him the way he looked at a stone that did not fit its bed, with patience and with the understanding that some things cannot be forced into the shape you want. "I am 68. I have a cough that tastes like iron, and I have been cold for 3 weeks in a way that is not about temperature." He placed his hand on the chamber wall, the warm, sweating limestone that carried the earth's heat upward through fractures older than any human story. "When I am gone, put your hand here and remember what I showed you. The stone tells you what the water is doing. You know it now without me." The echo was exact, Odman pressing Tolliff's hand against rock, teaching him to feel what could not be seen. 34 years old in the Black Hills and 9 years old in Telemark, and the hand was the same hand, and the stone was the same stone, and the lesson was the one lesson that had mattered. Tolliff sat in the warm air of the chamber after Odman fell asleep and listened to the old man breathe. The breath was wrong, too shallow, too fast, with a catch at the bottom like a door that would not close properly. The cloth strip on the far wall was limp and damp. The spring was flowing, the basin was finished, and the man who had taught him to read the earth was running out of the one thing the earth could not give back. Odmund Kvama died on the 4th of March, 1888, in his half-dug cabin near Minnetonka. Not in the spring chamber, not melodramatically on the slope. He died the way most people die, in a bed in a room with the stove going and the wind outside. Marit was with him. Tolliff arrived 20 minutes later, having walked the 8 miles from Cold Water Camp in a cold that no longer frightened him, but never stopped reminding him what it could do. The old man's hands were folded on his chest. The mason's hammer, the worn auger, and the canvas tool sack sat on the table beside the bed. Tolliff took the tools. He did not take the body. That was for the community at Minnecotta, who buried Odmund on a slope facing east, in ground that Tolliff helped dig through frozen soil because the work needed doing and because digging was something he could do when there was nothing else to be done. He walked back to Coldwater Camp, carrying the tools and the notebook. Rusk walked beside him. The sky was clear and bitter, and the stars were hard as nails. In the chamber that night, alone, Tolliff placed his hand against the warm stone and held it there until the heat moved through his skin and into the bones beneath. The water flowed. The cloth strip was limp. The spring did not know that Odmund was dead, and it would not care if it did, because the earth does not grieve. It only gives and gives and gives, and the people who learn to receive it carry the giving forward in hands that remember what they were taught. The secondary crisis came in late March, when Tolliff had been managing the spring alone for 3 weeks and had almost convinced himself that the hardest work was behind him. Spring thaw arrived early. Warm days melted the snowpack on the ridge above the chamber, sending meltwater cascading down the bluff face. The frozen waterfall that had sealed the spring entrance for months began to collapse in stages. First, the outer layers, crashing to the creek bed in slabs that shook the ground. Then the inner layers, calving from the rock face and taking chunks of the slope with them. On a Tuesday morning, a section of the slope above the chamber entrance gave way. Not the rock. The rock was solid, Madison Formation limestone that Odmund had tested and trusted, but the ice and packed earth above the rock sheared loose in a slab 30 feet wide, and when it fell, it carried the rope line, the plank walkway, and 6 feet of the entrance overhang with it. Tolliff heard the collapse from the settlement. The sound was not thunder. It was deeper, a tearing, grinding roar that made the ground vibrate under his boots. He ran to the bluff and found the approach path destroyed. The rope line hung in pieces. The lodgepole stakes dangled from the cliff face. The entrance was half buried under mud and rotten ice. Worse, inside the chamber, the collapse had jarred something loose. Red silt poured into the basin from a crack in the wall that had not been there the day before. The water, clear and mineral sweet for 2 months, turned the color of rust. The settling barrel overflowed. The drainage channel clogged. Tolliff stood at the wrecked entrance and felt the absence of Odmund like a hole in his chest. The old man would have known what to do. He would have read the rock, tapped the walls, diagnosed the silt source, and prescribed the fix with the calm authority of a man who had repaired stone spring houses for 40 years. Tolliff had a notebook. He had tools. He had 3 weeks of practice, and he had the memory of a hand on warm stone and a voice that said, "You know it now without me." He opened the notebook and found the page on sediment events. Odmund's handwriting, small and precise. When silt enters after disturbance, find the new fracture and divert. Do not seal ceiling redirects pressure. Build a bypass trench and settling crib upstream of the clean basin. Let the silt spend itself. Tolliff worked for 2 days. He cleared the entrance, rebuilt a temporary rope line, and crawled inside with the mason's hammer and a bucket. He found the new fracture. A crack in the shale band at the back of the chamber where the slope collapse had shifted the overburden and opened a path for surface meltwater to reach the spring. He could not seal it. Odmund's notebook said not to seal it. Instead, he cut a trench in the chamber floor with the chisel, angling it from the fracture toward the natural drain crack in the far wall, bypassing the clean basin entirely. He built a settling crib a small stone box filled with gravel and charcoal from the schoolhouse stove, and placed it where the trench crossed the path to the basin. The red water flowed through the trench, through the crib, and out the drain crack. The basin cleared within a day. The spring water ran clean again, and the silt channel became a permanent feature of the chamber, a scar from the thaw managed by the techniques of a dead man applied by the hands of the man he had taught. Marit came up to inspect the repair. She looked at the trench, the crib, the charcoal filter. She looked at the basin, clear and flowing. Odmund? She asked. His notebook, his method, my hands. Marit nodded. It was enough. Pike made his last serious play for control of the spring in April, and it failed in a way that cost him more than he expected. He brought a surveyor to Coldwater Camp, a man named Bernd Moen hired from Rapid City, carrying transit, chain, and a leather case of claim maps. Pike's argument was simple. The spring entrance lay on a section of land that intersected the boundary of his supply claim, and any structure built on or near that boundary was subject to his rights as claimant. Moen set up his transit on the draw and began measuring. He worked for a day, checking Pike's maps against the terrain, running the chain up the slope, marking reference points with wooden stakes. On the second morning, Moen asked to see Pike's original claim filing. Pike produced it. Moen looked at it for a long time, then at his own measurements, then at the terrain. Your northeast boundary is marked 60 feet east of where it actually falls, Moen said. That is a surveying error from the original filing. It is not a surveying error. The original filing matches the land office record. Your map has been redrawn. Moen folded the map and handed it back. The spring entrance is 23 feet outside your claim boundary. I will not certify otherwise. Pike took the map and left. He did not speak to Moen again. He did not speak to Tollef. He went to his store, closed the door, and did not come out for the rest of the day. Moen, before he departed, walked up to the spring entrance and looked inside. He tested the water, checked the temperature, and examined the stone basin and the drainage work. He said to Tollef, "This is well built. Who taught you?" "A man named Odmund Kvame. He is buried at Minakata." Moen nodded. "I knew his work. He repaired the bathhouse intake near the warm pools 2 years ago." He paused. "Keep the drainage clear, and this spring will outlast every building in this settlement." He left for Rapid City. Tollef watched him go and felt, for the first time since Odmund's death, that the spring's future extended beyond the next emergency. But Pike was still in his store, and Pike still held the debt notes of half the families in Coldwater Camp. The map had failed, but the ledger had not, and a man with a ledger in a settlement built on credit was never truly defeated. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the next hard season comes. In the weeks that followed, Tollef began to teach. He had not planned to. Teaching was not something freight haulers did. But people came to the chamber, not just from Coldwater Camp, but from nearby claims. Families who had heard about the warm spring that saved a settlement. And they asked questions Tollef could not ignore. How did you know the spring was there? What are the signs? Could there be warm water under my claim too? He showed them what Odmund had shown him. The mineral stain on rock, yellow-white, the residue of dissolved limestone, the moss that stays green under ice when everything else is dead, the hollow sound when you tap ice backed by air versus ice backed by stone, the behavior of animals, a dog that digs at ice, a horse that paws at a frozen seep, birds that gather where they should not in winter. He was careful with the teaching. He did not promise that every warm sign became a spring. He did not claim special knowledge beyond what Odmund had given him and what the earth had confirmed. He told the claim families to watch, listen, and test before they broke open anything. The spring was not conquered, he told a group of 3 families from the next draw over, standing in the warm chamber with the water flowing behind him. It was noticed. The dog noticed first. I noticed second. The difference between finding water and dying of thirst was paying attention to what the ground was already telling us. He taught Marit, Deputy Vale, and 2 teenagers, the Hogan boy and a girl named Christy Espeland, to maintain the spring independently. The rules were specific. No one enters with muddy boots past the first stone. Vent ice slowly in the morning. Do not break it. Let the warm air do the work. Check the cloth strips daily. If the inner strip stiffens, something has changed. Watch the settling crib. If the charcoal darkens, replace it. Read the vapor. If it shifts direction, the fracture pattern may be changing. Tollef wrote the rules in the notebook, underneath Odman's entries, in handwriting that was larger and less precise, but carried the same intention, that whoever read these words next would understand not just what to do, but why. The spring house grew, not into a resort, not into a business, but into a communal resource managed by the people who depended on it. Marit's chalk rotation expanded from water delivery to chamber maintenance. A posted board appeared at the entrance, clean pails only, no washing in the dip pool. First water to sick, children, and nursing mothers. No private claim on winter water. The rules were not Tollef's invention. They were the settlement's consensus, argued over at the schoolhouse and chalked by Marit's hand. But the authority behind them was the spring itself, the steady, patient flow of warm water through fractured limestone, answering every demand made of it without faltering, without cooling, without asking to be thanked. By May of 1888, a typical day at the spring house looked nothing like the desperate scramble of January, and everything like the careful rhythm of a community that had learned what it meant to share a resource. The morning crew arrived at dawn. 2 carriers, usually the Haugen boy and one of the ranch hands, climbed the rope line with empty milk cans strapped to their backs and returned within the hour carrying water for the schoolhouse barrel. The entrance was clear. The ice that had sealed the bluff through winter had melted back to a thin crust that Tollef chipped away each morning with 3 or 4 strokes of the chisel, more habit than necessity. The plank walkway had been rebuilt after the thaw collapse, wider now, with cross slats nailed at 6-inch intervals and a proper 2-post handrail that Tollef had set in stone anchors using Odman's method. Inside, the chamber was as it had been since January, warm, dripping, mineral sweet, the basin flowing. The permanent stone basin that Tollef and Odman had built together held its shape without shifting. The drainage channel ran clear. The settling crib sat where Tollef had placed it during the silt crisis. The charcoal darkened, but still filtering. The cloth strip on the far wall was limp and damp, as it had been every day since Odman first hung it there. Christy Espeland, the teenager Tollef had trained, managed the midday check. She read the vapor, its direction, its density, its smell, the way Tollef had taught her, which was the way Odman had taught him, which was the way spring housekeepers in Telemark had read vapor for generations they had never bothered to count. If the vapor shifted, she reported it. If the charcoal darkened past a certain shade, she replaced it. If the inner cloth strip stiffened even slightly, she found Tollef immediately. It had not stiffened, not once. The Earth's heat was patient and consistent in ways that human effort could never match. The afternoon crew brought the second delivery. 40 gallons by noon, 80 by nightfall, but the numbers Tollef had dreamed of during the crisis, when 10 gallons cost 4 hours and a man's frozen gloves. The difference was organization. Merritt's rotation ran like the gears of a clock she had built from chalk marks and stubbornness. Every team assigned, every vessel tracked, every gallon accounted for. The posted rules at the entrance had expanded. Clean pails only. No washing in the dip pool. First water to sick, children, and nursing mothers. No private claim on winter water. Carriers rest 1 day in 4. Report any change in watercolor, smell, or temperature to Tollef Breki or Marit Stensland. The last line was the one that mattered most. Not because changes were frequent, the spring had been stable since the silt crisis, but because the instruction embedded an attitude. The spring was not a well to be pumped until it failed. It was a living system to be watched, read, and maintained. Tollef's insistence on this point came directly from Oddmund, and through Oddmund from generations of Norwegian spring keepers who understood that water gives only as long as the people receiving it pay attention to what the water is telling them. Families from neighboring claims visited through the spring and summer. Some came for water, most came to learn. Tollef walked them through the chamber the way Oddmund had walked him, slowly, with attention, pointing out the mineral stain, the fracture lines, the moss, the vapor, the settling crib, the drainage channel. He showed them the notebook, open to the pages on identifying warm seeps, and read Oddmund's entries aloud in a voice that carried no pride of ownership because none was warranted. I did not build this spring, he told a rancher from 12 miles south who had brought his 2 sons to see the chamber. I found it because a dog barked at a cliff. An old man from Telemark taught me how to use it. Everything I know fits in this notebook and the space between these walls. The rancher's older son, a boy of 16, asked if there could be warm water under their claim. Maybe, Tollef said. Look for the signs. Mineral stain, green moss under ice, hollow ice over rock, animals where they should not be. Test the air before you break through. Chip slow. Let the hill breathe. He paused. And if you find nothing, do not be ashamed. Most hills have nothing to say. The ones that do will tell you if you listen. Not every warm sign became a spring. Tollef was honest about that. 2 families from nearby draws reported seeps that turned out to be shallow meltwater with no geothermal source. Warm for a day, then frozen again. One family found a sulfur vent that smelled promising but produced only vapor, no liquid. The disappointments were real, and Tollef did not soften them. But 3 families built marked rope lines to emergency water points on their own claims, following Tollef's method of staking, tying, and cross-slatting. 2 families identified genuine warm seeps, not full spring chambers, but reliable trickles that could fill a bucket in winter when the wells froze. The knowledge was spreading the way Oddmund's knowledge had spread, through hands, through observation, through the slow accumulation of attention paid to a landscape that rewarded attention and punished neglect. The summer of 1888 brought drought, not the dramatic drought of cracked riverbeds and dust storms. The Black Hills were too forested and too elevated for that, but a dry summer that shrank creeks, lowered wells, and turned the shallow cisterns behind the settlement's buildings into muddy reservoirs that tasted of sediment and rot. Pike's cistern went foul in August. He noticed the taste first, a swampy, organic bite that no amount of boiling could remove. Then the color changed from clear to amber to a greenish tint that made the water look like something found in a ditch rather than drawn from a stone-lined tank behind a store. He stopped drinking from it. He stopped selling it. He closed the lid and said nothing. But Cold Water Camp was small, and silence traveled as fast as gossip. Within 2 days, everyone knew Pike's water was bad. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The man who had tried to charge 2 cents a day for empty kerosene tins during the freeze was now the man whose own water source had failed during the heat. Pike held out for a week. He drank the last of his bottled stock. commercial mineral water he had ordered from Rapid City before the freight road washed out in a summer storm. When the bottles were empty, he had two choices: ride 8 miles to Minnetonka or walk 400 yards to the spring house with empty jugs. He chose the jugs. Tolliff was at the chamber entrance when Pike appeared at the bottom of the slope. The storekeeper climbed the rope line slowly, his two earthenware jugs clinking against his hip, his face set in the expression of a man who would rather be anywhere else on earth. He did not speak. He did not ask. He reached the entrance and stood there, jugs in hand, looking at Tolliff the way a man looks at a door he cannot bring himself to knock on. Tolliff took the jugs, crawled into the chamber, and filled them from the basin. The water was clean, clear, 85 degrees, the same temperature it had been in January and would be in every month that followed. He carried the jugs out and handed them back to Pike. "No charge," Tolliff said. Pike's jaw worked. He looked at the jugs, at the entrance, at the posted rules on the board beside the rope line. He looked at Tolliff's hands, scarred, calloused, the knuckles still rough from the chisel work that had opened the chamber 7 months ago. He opened his mouth to say something, and what came out was nothing. The silence of a man who had run out of leverage. Marit was on the slope below, coming up with the afternoon crew. She saw Pike, saw the jugs, saw Tolliff's face. She climbed the last 20 feet and stopped beside them. "Debt is yours," she said to Pike. "Water is not." Pike took the jugs and descended. He did not thank them. He did not apologize. He did not become noble or generous or changed. He became smaller. The man who had tried to price control the survival of a settlement walked down the slope with 2 jugs of free water, and the walk was longer going down than it had been coming up, because going down he had to face the settlement that had watched him climb. He came back 3 more times that summer. Each time, Tolliff filled the jugs. Each time, Pike said nothing. By the 4th visit, he left a sack of flour at the base of the slope. Not payment, not charity, just a sack of flour placed where someone would find it. Marit found it and entered it in her ledger without comment. Pike sold the store in the autumn of 1889 and left Coldwater Camp for Deadwood. He was not remembered as a villain. He was remembered as the man who tried to sell water during the freeze, and who came to the spring house with empty jugs when his own water failed, and who left a sack of flour at the bottom of the slope because it was the only language he knew for the thing he could not say. The courtship of Tolliff Preka and Marit Stensland did not look like courtship. It looked like work. It began in the chamber, during the weeks of repair after the thaw collapse, when they spent hours together hauling stone, clearing debris, and rebuilding the entrance path. Tolliff noticed that Marit handled tools with the confidence of a person who had been handed them young and never put them down. She noticed that Tolliff, for a man who had spent a decade working alone, was surprisingly good at making space for another person's method. They argued about the rope line. Tolliff wanted it doubled at the steepest section. Marit said tripled with a separate line for empty-handed descent, so that carriers going up would not collide with carriers coming down. She was right. The 2-line system saved time and prevented the tangles that had twice sent carriers sliding. They argued about the posted rules. Tolliff wanted to add a line about livestock water, specifying that horses and mules be watered from the overflow channel, not the clean basin. Marit said the rule was obvious and did not need writing. She was wrong. Within a week, a ranch hand led his horse to the basin, and Marit nailed the new rule to the board herself. They did not argue about the ledger. Marit kept the numbers. Tolliff kept the spring. The division was natural, and neither of them questioned it, the way neither of them questioned that the sun rose in the east, or that Rusk would be lying at the chamber entrance whenever anyone arrived. The courtship happened in the margins. A hand extended to help the other over a rock ledge. A cup of warm water passed without being asked for. A conversation at dusk, sitting on the slope with the settlement below and the ridge above and Rusk between them, about what the spring house could become if the settlement grew, about what kind of person would come to a place like Coldwater Camp on purpose, about what it meant to owe a dead man a debt that could not be repaid except by doing the work he had started. Tolef told Marit about his wife. Not much. He was not a man who talked about wounds, but enough. She had died of fever during a haul he should not have taken. He had been 60 miles away when it happened. By the time he returned, she had been buried for 3 days. Marit told Tolef about her husband. He had been a ranch hand, killed in a horse accident before they had been married a year. She had kept the claim, worked it alone, and built a reputation for competence that most men in the settlement envied and none would admit to. They were two people who had survived loss by working, and who recognized in each other the particular quality of a person who builds things, because building is what keeps them standing. They married in the autumn of 1889 near the spring house entrance, with Dr. Callow standing as witness, and Deputy Vale holding Rusk's collar so the dog would not climb onto the stone ledge where they exchanged vows. The ceremony was brief. The meal afterward was warm spring water, venison, and biscuits made with flour from Pike's store, the last of the inventory before the new owner restocked. Marit moved into Tolef's shack and immediately declared it inadequate. By the following spring, they had built a frame house, 16 by 24 feet, with a stone foundation laid by Tolef using Odman's methods, and a proper kitchen with a window facing the ridge. From that window, on cold mornings, Marit could see the thin white breath of vapor rising from the spring house entrance, and she checked it the way she checked every resource under her management, daily, without sentiment, with the attention of a person who knew that what the earth gives, the earth can take back. The years compress the way years do when the crisis has passed and the living begins. Tolef and Marit's first child was born in the summer of 1890, a boy they named Odmund, after the man whose tools still hung on the wall above the kitchen table. 2 more followed, a girl in 92 and a second boy in 95. The children grew up with the spring house the way other children grew up with a barn or a well. It was simply part of the landscape, a place where water came from and where their father went every morning with his chisel and his dog. Rusk lived longer than anyone expected. The dog who had found the spring, who had led the midnight climb through the whiteout, who had herded Vale's lost group up the slope by barking in the dark, who had lain at the chamber entrance every day like a sentinel too modest to call himself one. Rusk lived until the autumn of 1893. He slowed in his last year, the way old dogs slow, his muzzle white and his hips stiff on the climb. But he went to the spring house every morning until the last week, when Tolef carried him up the slope because the dog could not stop trying, and Tolef could not bear to let him fail. They buried Rusk under a flat stone near the trail, where the slope leveled before the final climb to the entrance. Tolef carved nothing on the stone. The people who needed to know what was buried there already knew, and the people who came later would not understand even if it was explained. Dr. Callow practiced medicine in Coldwater Camp until 1897, when his own body finally presented him with a case he could not treat. He spent his last weeks in the spring chamber, breathing the warm mineral air, seated on the same ledge where he had revived Marte Lund 9 years earlier. A younger physician from Rapid City, trained partly by Callow during summer visits, took over his practice. Callow died with his medical bag beside his bed and his notebook open to the page where he had written mineral air treatment in the careful hand of a man who believed he was documenting something new. Deputy Vale became county sheriff in 1891, which surprised no one who had seen him lead 6 people up a frozen slope in a blizzard with a lantern that would not stay lit. He credited the promotion to stubbornness. Marit credited it to the fact that he had learned to follow a dog. Marte Lunde recovered fully from the lung fever that had nearly killed her during the freeze. She married a homesteader from the next valley in 1890 and raised 4 children. She never spoke about the night in the chamber, the plank sled, the whiteout climb, the warm water on her cracked lips, except once to her oldest daughter, who asked why the family always kept 6 gallons of water stored and covered, even in summer. Because I know what it means to not have it, Marte said, and that was all she said. The spring house itself outlasted the settlement it had saved. Buildings rotted, roof lines sagged, families moved to Rapid City or Deadwood or back east. Coldwater Camp shrank from 27 people to 14 to 6. By 1900, only 3 families remained year-round, and the schoolhouse had been converted to a feed storage building. But the spring flowed. The basin held. The drainage channel ran clear. The posted rules, chalked and rechalked by different hands over the years, still hung on a board at the entrance. The last version, written by Marit in the summer of 1901, added a line at the bottom that had not been there before. This water was found by a dog named Rusk and kept clean by a man named Oddman Kvame. Respect what they gave. Tollef Breka lived the rest of his life within sight of the ridge. He became quieter as the years passed, not from sadness, but from the particular economy of a man who had said the important things and saw no reason to repeat them. He maintained the spring house until his hands could not hold the chisel, and then he taught his oldest son to hold it, and the boy maintained it with the same attention his father had learned from a 68-year-old stoneworker in the middle of the worst freeze the Black Hills had seen in a decade. Tollef told the story of the spring only when asked, and he always began with the dog, not himself. Rusk barked at the cliff, he would say. I was just the one who listened. On the coldest mornings, the kind that come to the southern Black Hills in January and make the world go still and white and silent, the creek lies frozen under blue ice. The wells wear lids of iron frost. The draws quiet, no water sound, no movement. The kind of cold that makes a man believe the earth has closed its hand and will not open it again. Cassian Pike once stood behind his counter in a warm store and said, A dog cannot smell water through stone, Breka. The dog is buried under a flat stone near the trail. The man who listened to the dog is buried beside the frame house with the window facing the ridge. The woman who carried the first kettle and managed every gallon after it is buried beside him. The stoneworker who taught them both what the earth was saying rests on an east-facing slope near Minnetonka, where the warm springs still flow at 87 degrees and the water still tastes of limestone and deep thyme. But from one crack in the bluff, on the coldest mornings when every other source of water for miles has gone silent and the frost seals the world shut, a thin white breath rises into the dark. Steady, continuous, warm. The spring exhaling through stone, the way it did before any person stood on that slope, the way it will after the last stone marker is covered by snow and the last name is forgotten. The earth does not forget where its warmth goes. It only waits for someone to notice.